program, which I'm sure has been very interesting and exciting for all of you. So hello and welcome to this panel talk that we've chosen to call Unsettling Conversation. My name is Katarina Gabrielsson and I'm currently the Director of Center for a Sustainable Built Environment at the School of Architecture and the Built Environment here at KTH. When I was approached by Vanya, who you already know, asking me if the Centre could support the conference Crime and Fear in Public Places, I saw it as an opportunity to initiate a series of talks intending to promote exchange between different researchers at the ABE School. In its 10-year national programme for research on a sustainable built environment, the national research funding body, Formas, calls for an entire rethinking of research and identifies cross-disciplinary collaborations as essential if we are to properly address and develop new approaches to today's extensive and multifaceted challenges. And clearly, the ABE School carries unique potential in housing so many different scientific traditions and lines of inquiry, yet few of us know what goes on outside our own department. Cross-institutional collaboration is not only made difficult by practical reasons, however, but also by the fact that scientists from the humanities, the social, and the natural sciences have indeed very different vantage points. The mindset of an engineer, a philosopher, or a historian can differ to such an extent that we, to a certain respect, don't even speak the same language. So the setup for this conversation is a first attempt to address this situation and to investigate the potential of combining different fields of expertise. The subject lodges onto the theme of the conference, but aims to add new perspectives by coming at it from different directions, which is also to say that this conversation is a bit of an experiment. I'm very happy to have these distinguished researchers on the panel tonight. Vanya Ceccato, whom you already know, who's an urban geographer with an expertise in safety. Annika Karlsson-Kanyama, sitting next to her, who conducts research about climate change adaptation with a special focus on methods for handling uncertainties. Okay, you're sitting in a different order, so as how I've written it. Jonathan Mesker, sitting here, whose research deals with decision-making as it relates to environmental issues, with a focus on urban and regional planning, policy and politics. And finally, Erik Stenberg, who has a long-standing engagement in the practice and politics of restructuring the large-scale post-war modernist housing areas known as the Millennium Programme era, from the Millennium Programme era in Sweden. And they will, in just a few moments, introduce themselves and their topics of research in greater detail. But before we commence, I will just briefly stake out the topic at hand. So the title is The Politics of Fear and Safety, Dealing with Uncertainties in Planning. As many of us know, at least those of us who are from Sweden, the recent election campaign in Sweden put significant emphasis on questions of crime and safety. Politicians of all kind of colors claim to be responding to people's anxieties by promising harder measures against presumably rising levels of violence and crime, to combat the emergence of so-called no-go areas, and to guarantee public safety. While the provision of safe, accessible and healthy environments is listed as part of the UN sustainability goals, the implications of safety are far from certain, however, and the implementation remains a challenge. Current research supports a much more complex understanding of the relations between, for instance, gender, security, safety and space. And as far as I understand it, there is, for instance, a very important difference between real and perceived risks. The experience of fear has a clear correlation to the news media. And I imagine that there are many nuances and layers as to who, how, and what, and where is actually affected by crime. So the question is how we can think about these politics of fear and safety in relation to the built environment. And if safety ultimately is a matter of perception rather than sort of probability, how can planning deal with such uncertainties and insecurities? So we will start by you briefly presenting yourselves, and maybe we will do it in this order that you're sitting. Okay.
Should I start?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction, Katarina, and it's very exciting for me to be here. This is a research context, a topic that I don't deal with that directly in my own research regularly. As Katarina said, most of my research is quite broad, my research interest, but in one way or another, it usually touches upon decision-making processes regarding regional and urban development in various ways, and with a particular focus on complex environmental problems. Environmental in a broad sense, meaning, for instance, what goes on in a specific place. Everything happens somewhere, right? So all problems are environmental to some extent. So this is an understanding of and study of problems that are defined also spatially. And the interesting thing with that kind of problems of development of places, for instance, is if you look long enough, they always turn out to be complex in one way or another. Planning, of course, always, as I just said, it happens somewhere in a place at a specific time, and it relates to specific issues. But on the most generic of levels, I would nonetheless claim that planning is, to a great extent, always about formulating, about articulating fears and hopes based on which we then supposedly need to take action in the present to secure some form of future positive outcome. So I would say that the politics of fear and safety, or at least fear and hope, in various orchestrations is always a fundamental component of any planning process anywhere. We want to achieve certain things with the future development, and we want to avoid other things. So fear of the wrong kind of development is always there, and hopes for a better development, however that is defined, is always there also, whether implicitly or explicitly. Inevitably, since places are complex entities, place development and planning is always inherently conflictual when it comes to the goal frame. And there's a wickedness to the problems of the future we want to places to develop into. And the key questions then is, of course, what issues is it, or what qualities is it that gain the most policy attention, and at what price? What comes on top of the agenda and is in the attention of the minds of those who work with these processes and who are involved in these processes, and what falls into the background, because you cannot attend to everything always. Attention is a scarce resource. That's one of the first lessons of any organizational theory. And then the follow-up question is, of course, what are we prepared to give up to alleviate a particular fear or try to fulfill a specific hope? And very crucially, who are the we? What are the potential discrepancies between various engaged publics that might have something at stake in the development of a particular place? And what are the incongruences between these various publics and, for instance, elected representatives and professionals and their various priorities based on education, based on cultural background, based on their embodied situatedness, and so on? So what to do? I think what we need to do is to begin in relation to the politics of fear and safety broadly to remind us about the philosopher David Hume's stern warning from already 1739, that one can never deduce a normative statement of ought from an analytical statement of is. The state of the world cannot in itself dictate what is good or right, or how to prioritize between different conflicting goods. This is a question of politics. What level, to bring back to the topic of politics of fear and safety then, what level, for instance, of unsafety is acceptable for us to have, if we have that as a trade-off against, for instance, lively urban environments? What risk of individual harm are we prepared to accept for a collective good? These are unpalatable questions, but these are the kind of questions that planners have to navigate every day, whether they recognize this or not. And at the same time, it's important to keep in mind that we sometimes have ideas of things that we believe are in conflict fundamentally. For instance, urban ambience of various kinds and perhaps aspects of safety. But where there may be innovative solutions previously unimagined that are possible, which, so to say, can contribute to cutting the Gordian knot and reformulating the problem in a new way, possibly in more tractable terms. And here I think research fills a very important function in forming new perspectives and understandings of previously seemingly unresolvable problems. But I want to round off by saying every solution, no matter how appetizing and full-headed at a first glance, always has its blind spots. And therefore we must also be vigilant about the new problems that we risk creating when we are busy solving old ones. And I'll leave it at that, I think, for now.
Thank you for that exhaustive opening, those opening comments, Jonathan. Erik, if I can ask you to go on.
Yeah. Is this when we show the images?
No.
No. This is just an opening.
No, you show the images. Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you have to sit here.
It's part of sort of setting
maybe Vanya can
yourself.
help.
So.
Okay, so hi. My name is Erik Stenberg. I'm Associate Professor of Architecture. And my field of research is really housing in general, but specifically it's the prefabricated structural systems of the Million Program era. So that's such a small image. Can you go to full screen? It's usually Control L, if you push L. There we go. So this is not meant for you to be able to read as much as for me to tell you what it says. So just trust me on this one. This is a 150-year curve of Swedish housing production. And from the left to the right is 150 years by 5-year increments. And you have the red-orange line is the total production of housing units in Sweden year by year in tens of thousands. So each horizontal line is 10,000. And the blue line is multifamily housing. So the difference between the orange and the blue, or the distance between the orange and the blue, is single-family homes. And what I'm specifically interested in is the peak between 1965 and 1974, which is called the Million Program era, or the Million Program Homes, or Million Homes Program, where Sweden produced 1 million units of housing in a 10-year period. And this was the culmination of the post-war effort to build better and more housing. And this was an incredible societal effort, which you can call the people's home, folkhemmet, or the welfare state, välfärdsstaten. You can call it modernism, you can call it many things. And in order to understand the peak, I've also been able, or have had to look at the prehistory. And therefore, it stretches all the way back to the early 1900s, with the rise of housing as a way of dealing with the rising urbanization. And then I've also had to look at what happened afterwards. And this is where it gets interesting in terms of the topic today, because there was a very rapid decline, which was linked to really a number of issues that confluenced together, such as the OPEC oil crisis in 1973, such as the student revolt in Paris 1968, where there was a critique of the top-down planning of the post-war era. And then this was replaced by an ambition to plan and build bottom-up. And if we look at the production from the 70s up until the mid-90s, it has, first of all, a large bulk of single-family homes. So this is also a reaction to the critique of the multifamily areas. And then it has a peak which is linked to the rise of the global economy, which had the Swedish banking crisis at the end of the 80s. And then there's a period which is maybe even more interesting from 1995 to 2015, which I would say was the market-driven housing period. And this is where almost no housing is produced. So we have a very slim output. And then the rest of the graph is actually projections for the future. And you can see by the diagrams that there are discussions of entering into a new period of the Million Program. The demand is at the same levels. I argue that we don't have the knowledge or the capacity to produce another Million Program, and not anywhere near the level of understanding, either at the production or the planning side. And finally, on top of this, we have the fact that the Million Program is celebrating during this period now 50 years. So for example, one of the premier areas, Skärholmen, was inaugurated 50 years ago, and there's a great renovation need. So this is what I've been working with as a practicing architect, and also as a researcher in working in restructuring Million Program areas to fit current needs. So next slide. So what I've come to see as the big question is how this grand political ambition of creating safe spaces involved in the welfare state, that can be summarized almost best by this image that HSB, one of the main housing producers, put out a document in 1970 called A Social Crane. And they meant that they were actually lifting the whole social situation. And at the same time, the crane was lifting the elements, to the panel elements, to produce these units of housing. So there's a double meaning to the title. And then the next slide. And then contrasted with this image, this is Rapport Tensta, also from early 70s, which is the first instance of the critique of the large-scale housing areas, which places the children in a building or a construction site, saying that their safety is being challenged by bad urban planning. So it says that this is when Tensta is given the name of being a bad place because of the planners. So the residents of Tensta are victims of bad planning. And so this contrast between the reaction and the grand ambition takes up a lot of my time. And I might be able to contribute a little bit to today's discussion with that understanding. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. Annika then, please.
Yeah, I'm a natural scientist, background in resource management. And I've been working since 2007. I have several research areas, but the reason I'm here is because since 2007 I've been working with adaptation to climate change. And that is opposed to mitigation. Mitigation is when you lower your emissions, and that's what we hear a lot about. We have to do something about the emissions. We have like 10 years to turn everything around and so on. But at the same time, climate change is happening, and it is already affecting us. You saw the heat wave this summer, for example. The sea levels are rising and so on. So whether we lower the emissions or not, we have to adapt to new weather patterns. So we have, in a project which is ongoing, we are trying out something called robust decision-making methods, which have been developed to cope with uncertainty in the impacts of climate change. One important impact of climate change is rising sea levels. And there are large uncertainties in how much will the sea rise. Eventually, if all the ice on Greenland and Antarctica melt, I think we will have a sea level rise of 70 meters. There are no plans for how to cope with that, of course. Anyway, even if we look at for the year 2100, which is a very relevant level for planners in municipalities, there are large differences in the projections of sea level rise. And how can a municipality cope with those uncertainties? That's what we are asking ourselves. We are working with municipalities along the Baltic coast, and all these municipalities, whether they are in Stockholm or further north, want to build houses by the seashore to attract wealthy citizens that will give them a large tax income. Everybody thinks rich people are going to move to their municipality and live in houses by the sea. And of course, if you plan for that, you have to have some plan for how to cope with the sea level rise. And so far, what has been done is to expect a maximum of 1 meter by 2100, more than today. So all municipalities in Sweden more or less have planned for that. But when they do that, they ignore science that say that it can become much more, about 2.5, 3 meters. And after that, the sea level will continue to rise, and the houses that built today may be there for another 100 years at least. Yes, so this is just future average sea level rise in Danderyd. That's the most wealthy municipality in Sweden. They want to build more houses for rich people, of course, by the sea. And we have worked with them in order to plan for how to cope with different levels of sea level rise. So we can take the next. Robust decision making is can be essentially summarized in 3 principles. You should embrace uncertainties, not ignore them, and consider a full range of uncertainties. You shouldn't be blind and say, let's not look at the worst case, it will probably not happen, Let's look at the medium case. That's not a very good idea. Try to embrace the full range of uncertainties. Use a bottom-up process. Start with the area at hand and look what are the problems and what will be the impacts there, what will be suited to these local areas. And there are different strategies that you can use. You can use static ones that will take you through all kinds of impacts, or flexible ones. You do something, you wait and see what happens, and then you do something else. We can take the next one. And we work with something called, we develop maps of adaptation pathways. This is made by using a software created in the Netherlands by people working with this. And this is a map of possible options for protecting an area close to the sea in Danderyd for raising sea levels. Different levels of sea level rise. And eventually you can find a way to combine solutions that will eventually protect the area up to 3 meters of sea level rise. This was a choice made by the municipality. They say after this, well, maybe we just all have to move away or something. So this is the way we work now with municipalities, and these municipalities are not used to handling uncertainties. They want to know, they want to tell authorities, tell us where the line is, and then we adhere to it. That's what they like to do. So we are working with these methods, and maybe some of these, I'm trying to connect to the topic of this conversation. I don't know if some of these ways to handling uncertainties could be relevant to how you handle safety and security in our areas. Maybe, or maybe not. I also want to say that I live in one of these million program areas that are considered problematic, and I've been living there for 2 decades. It's southwest of Stockholm. And living in such an area, one of the biggest problems is how people in more wealthy areas look at the place where we are living. And that's something which is bothering a lot of people in these so-called problem areas and make them feel more unsafe and more unhappy. And from my perspective, I think that's a real problem that we have to address. And it's also related to ethnicity. In the areas which are problematic, a larger part of the population than otherwise have a foreign background. either have a parent born abroad or coming from abroad and so on. So it's also a matter of ethnicity and racism, I would say. And I want to throw this into the debate, actually.
Yeah, it's on my list, actually. And then finally, Vanya.
I feel privileged to be the last one because I can hook up in so many ideas. The geographer who says about that planning needs a place, crime needs a place, fear needs a place. It happens somewhere. But I think that there are things that Eric mentioned about quality. That's why we also, I think, take from there, and also from the issues of area stigmatization. Because I live, by the way, in Danderyd, and I can see the other way around, how people would say, well, maybe, you know, so it's the other way around. So I think I would choose a point to make. We have been, I think the topic is about fear and uncertainties, two important points. And I do think, I agree with you when you say that, or if it was you who mentioned that crime and fear are different animals. For sure they are. And that they should keep it separately. Why? Because crime has its own set of theories, and the way that we interpreted why crime happens is very different from fear. And it's not only that. It is also, I mean, if you think about fear, you are not only talking about fear of crime. You are talking about, for instance, for those who live in rural areas, when you ask about crime or being worried, people are thinking about jobs. They are not thinking about crime. So there is a very nice statistics across Sweden that show that if you ask people about how worried they are, you don't see any difference across the country. But if you ask them, are you worried in your neighborhood, then the picture shows a clear urban hierarchy, for big cities being very high in terms of perceived safety and very low in rural areas. So what I'm trying to say is that fear of crime may reflect patterns of crime that happens in urban environments, but if you think about fear in general, we would think that is a process that is actually composed by many other factors and overall anxieties and things like that. Even political instability that we live nowadays. Threats that are far beyond things like, as Gideon's talk about, ontological insecurity. Today we live in times that we cannot predict what happens tomorrow. In the past, there was a much more clear path between, even in our lives, what happens yes and from what. So the world is much more plural, and the uncertainties are growing, and that's why we end up declaring fear when we actually might feel quite safe and we are not even victimized. So honestly, crime and fear are two different animals. They should be kept separately, also because society, the institutions of society, I'm just looking there, institutions of society, I'm sorry, I didn't thought about, institutions of a society that deals with crime and fear actually are different. So the police are supposed to actually chase criminals. Now nowadays, I think with kinds of community policing, we might engage also in some sort of fear business, helping out with what's called safety walks and things like that. But the primary role of the police is actually trying to solve crimes, to try to prevent crimes to happen. So maybe we would have other types of institutions that would deal with fear. So honestly, crime and fear should be kept separately. The other point that I still would like to connect a little bit, I think, more with you, Eric, but also a little bit with Jonathan, is the idea of safety. For me, safety is an individual right. This is something very, very important. When you think in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, and safety is there, something really basic that is for us. You also mentioned the topic collective good. I also agree. Safety is also a collective good, that it should be really in the hands, if I use this extreme term, of governments, to make sure that they continue being a collective good. Why? Because safety is an individual right. So the public sector, the state, should make sure that, or at least strive to, that individuals will feel safe. Honestly, I know it is some kind of it's a utopia in the way that we are turning to societies that actually have different, socioeconomic levels. And this leads me to the third term. Safety is individual right, is a collective good that should be basically ensured by the public or the state. But also we have to see that with the developments that we have today, more and more safety is becoming a product. I come from a country that has loads of gated communities. My city has 100, our city has about maybe 160 inhabitants, is that so? 190. Well, it grew since I left. But we have loads of, nowadays, of gated communities, which really, really make me angry. And it's just an example of how the commodification of security has become a product. Here in Sweden, it takes other shapes. It is about segregations of different forms, but it is about all different kinds of gadgets for those who can pay, right? And this is the problem. Those who can pay can also, how can these two things go together? If it is a public good, if it is a collective good, if it is an individual right, but is a product, it means also that not everybody has the actually access to that product. And this, I think, that the most important thing. How can we plan for societies actually that can balance the bads and goods, like Ross mentioned, right? Because it is about that. Bad would be crime, fear, and the goods is safety. How do we balance that when actually safety is becoming more and more commodified? So, and the answer is for planning. How is it good to have lots of crime, and the crime is very homogeneous across society, or is less, but very unbalanced? Only the poor that is, like we have more now, that is targeted by crime. Which kinds of society actually we want? Unbalanced, goods and bads, I think is essential here. I mean, the discussion about goods and bads by Rawls, if you are familiar with, is I would apply this for crime versus safety. How can we balance the goods and bads, thinking about safety as an individual right and safety as a commodity? I think it's the most biggest challenge we have ahead, thinking about segregation and stigmatization that you just mentioned.
If I could... Okay, if I can just butt in there a bit, because thinking about what Jonathan pointed out in terms of attention span and a limited amount of issues that are actually on the agenda, it's pretty striking that it seems like most municipalities choose to ignore the risks of climate change and having a difficult time to accept that they have to adapt to that, which is at the core of your research project. And at the same time, there's this, I get the feeling that there's a kind of exaggerated and very highly medialized perception of real danger that we are subjected to, at least just judging by the rhetorics during the political campaign. Would you agree? As far as I understand it, safety is basically a matter of perception. It's a sense, it's an emotion, it's a... Or how would you define safety? Or in what way is sort of safety linked to some sort of probability, or what is actually what the actual risks are? Is there a clear correlation between that?
Should I answer?
Yeah, and then
I
I'd
think
like to know
one way of looking at is you can look at safety in a more concrete way, I would say, and concrete I mean likelihood, risk, and obviously you can talk about risk of rape, as I was doing during this afternoon. Which is more like tangible. Obviously, you can talk about those terms. But also in Swedish, you have two words. One is säkerhet, and the other is otrygghet. And I think I like that. We don't have that in Portuguese, and maybe we do in English. But my point is, safety and security. But my point is there is one dimension that can be, if you approach in a more quantitative way and talk about risks, but also you can talk in terms of perceived safety, which is an emotion, the dread that something happened. And honestly, I do think that it's all, it's not right and wrong, it's all about how you frame the question. What is actually your question in terms of how you think about, for instance, the questions about climate change? It's much more, I think it's easier to talk about time frames in terms of risk of being victimized than the risk of having your house flooded, because it looks something much more like far away in terms of a spectrum. It's going to be maybe my daughter and son or whatever. So if I couple up with the ideas of risk and motion. I don't know if I make up my point, but I do think that it's not one or the other. I think normally when you work with issues of safety, you have to deal with both. It's not wrong to deal with only with perceived safety, but obviously it's the way you frame. And neither is wrong to say something about the risk for crime, because sometimes we want to know how risky it is to be in certain places at certain times.
Can I add something?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's still quite uncommon that when you work with, for example, safety and security at the local level, that you include the impacts of extreme weather events. But they are already here. There are flash floods not occurring yet here, but in Copenhagen some time ago there are heat waves. that cause people, mainly elderly people, to die, or people with diseases. So I think it would be, I can't judge whether it's more serious, the threats of extreme weather or being mugged or something like that. I have no idea. But I think I have the impression that being mugged, being fear of rape, being mugged and so on, it's much more on the agenda than, for example, extreme weather. I may be wrong there, but I think there should be an adjustment. And there will be an adjustment as we see the consequences of climate change coming on.
Jonathan,
yes.
did you want?
I'm grateful, Vanya, that you mentioned ontological insecurity in Giddens, because I think if we can, have one collective diagnosis of our society right now, it's a more generalized anxiety kind of syndrome. And because we have all these very sensed intangible threats like climate change. I mean, as you say, Annika, they're becoming very tangible. We're not just making the connections sometimes, but I think a lot of people feel them to be intangible. And I mean, this is a little bit speculative, but I get the sense that this generalized anxiety is then channeled into what is very specific and at hand. So a fear of burglary, a fear of assault that's rising, a fear of that my local environment is unsafe. So to some degree, I think, people we should make sure with all the knowledge we have that people aren't victimized. But I see also in planning processes, in the general societal discourse, in the Western world even, and in local planning, that safety is becoming a highly prioritized. If we talk about limited attention, sort of in the design of public places, for instance. And again, this is not to kind of disparage the important knowledge there is, but I also see this as part of a societal pathology. And I think also there is this problem. I just want to come back to this question of also the weighing of different goods, as you say, not just goods and bads, but also goods and goods, because I think that's one of the most problematic things. This is an area I haven't been into for a while, but I think it's illustrative. It's when I worked as a planner a long time ago now, I realized, but there was a discussion about Stockholm and having a lively nighttime economy and caring for that, because that is very important to the attractivity of urban areas, both locally and on a metropolitan scale. At the same time, there is a lot of research, or at least then, 10 years ago, there was a lot of research showing the correlation of being exposed to the nighttime economy and having it present, and violent crime, especially violent crime. So I guess that's a complex. You want the nighttime economy, but you don't want so how to weigh that? And of course that's very unpalatable, because who is to say that we can accept that people will get, hurt, possibly even killed? Because there is a statistical relationship there that if we accept more nighttime economy and we are more liberal in this, well, there will be more physical bodily harm. And I mean, for instance, in traffic, which is another area I just touch upon, I mean, it's very unpalatable. We have a zero vision in Sweden of traffic deaths. At the same time, we have a statistical value of a human life, which is at present is 40 million kronor approximately. So you plug that into a economical cost-benefit model, and if a certain change of the road design costs more than 40 million, well, actually, you don't follow the zero. And that's, I mean, it's all very unpalatable, but I think these are the kind of questions that we have to kind of face, that it's always this, you cannot escape the unpalatability of planning and having to always face those things. And I think being upfront with it is really important.
But I'm sort of curious about really basic questions, which is, would we know what it would mean to plan for a safe environment? Because there's an old kind of, going back to Jane Jacobs, eyes on the street, and the diverse city makes for a safer city. And yet there's evidence that this isn't true. So I'm sort of fishing after some sort of basic uncertainty in terms of the connection between safety and space that can provide some sort of empirical base for planning. And it's not least in terms of looking at the sort of highly stigmatized planning of the era that you're interested in, Erik. Yeah,
I don't have an answer to that question, but I have some trends that I'm interested in relating to that subject, and one of them, of course, is the post-war buildup of the ambition to provide more space, and what they meant was interior space for each citizen to the point where we went from having in Sweden the lowest standard of housing to the highest standard of housing in Europe in a 30-year time. And I think we have somewhere around 50 square meters of housing space per person in Sweden, which is an enormous amount in an international context. And the ambition was clearly to reduce overcrowding, but also to give safe space to kids. If the kids could have their own room, if they could have a place to study, if they could, if there was a big enough living room to have friends over, then you can conduct your, albeit normative life, in that space. And the society was working hard to provide this safe space. If we now contrast that with the condition today, that we are for many times environmental reasons, and also in terms of planning, kind of a resurgence of the bourgeois city planning. We are building tighter cities with actually much smaller apartments. So we are now removing that space and replacing it by the image or the understanding of the city as the receiver of all of us. So we, at the far end of the scale, I question whether housing will actually be built in the future city, because we will have some other concept. If we push, I'm not proposing this. I'm saying that this is a. If you continue the current trends of how we should live, then you could pull it so far that you can say that we won't need housing in 50 years. I don't believe it, but what would that mean for the life of the city in terms of fear and safety and in terms of growing up? I think that is, well, I guess I'm afraid of thinking, yeah, it scares me, yeah, the consequences scare me.
You have to explain. We won't need housing. How will we live in a, in a small space, each one of us, like in Japanese hotel or like a...
Well, there are a number of initiatives in terms of co-living, co-housing. We will be sleeping in our workplaces. And there will, there's space, and we don't know really whose space, but we're paying, and that space we can work, live, play, hang out. So there's lots of space, but whose space? It's not in the sense that we see the post-war buildup of the home. As normative as it was, there was at least an allocation of space in the idea of a home. And I see that eroding mostly in words, but somewhat in action also, in terms of just look at Airbnb, whose home, whose place. There's a
long stay hotel.
Long stay hotels. There's a challenge to the idea of the home, that if you push it long enough or far enough, then you could say that, well, we won't need to build housing, we'll just build space or offices, and then we'll sleep there on the couch.
But that would require a lot of trust from everybody. You have to trust people who space you are using for this night.
Or pay them enough.
Yes, but you still have to trust them.
Yeah.
That this is a safe space.
Sure.
Since you don't have the key yourself.
Right, which puts us somewhere back into the late 1800s.
Yes.
Yeah.
When the congested and dense kind of urban slums were really seen as a site of crime, that had to be cleansed out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, another strand then to do with planning. I was thinking of your work, Jonathan, about the post-political and post-political planning that indicates that planning is sort of, as we know it conventionally, is steered by kind of political commitment and so on, and political legitimacy has been replaced by a sort of seemingly neutral management, urban management. And how would you say that, how can we think about post-political planning then, and the means for planning in terms of addressing the sort of the public fears and issues of safety? is it, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of doing workshops with policymakers and planners in terms of pretty hard scientific evidence that presents the possible rising levels of the sea or the risks of extreme weather and so on and so forth. It seems to present itself as pretty hard facts, but in terms of safety and fear, it's maybe more emotionally driven. And I'm just curious to know, how can we think about planning with these insecurities when planning is reduced to some sort of management?
Yeah, and I think I come back then also to the classical kind of political science term of which is also in decision making, of agenda setting, which is, I think, when we talk about post-politics, it's about very much about how agenda setting practices that can be quite, under subterfuge. Well, my favorite example of what, so what do you mean by a post-political situation? Well, it's when you have a participation event, for instance. You invite all the people in a neighborhood and say, there's going to be a great new development here, a skyscraper, but it's going to be collaborative. So you're going to be, part of deciding what color it should be. But the question of whether there should be a skyscraper or not in there, that's not on the table. But you can be part of deciding if it should be light brown glass or dark brown glass facade. So I think that's also the question when it comes to safety, for instance, that, when you have a workshop, how should we make this park more safe? I think an important question is, and that's coming back to the question of this generalized anxiety. Well, is that the most important question just we need to ask about this park? How should the questions about the designs of this park, what should be prioritized? Needs to be settled first. That cannot be a set agenda. At the same time, and there's another more complex layer to it, and I think that's, you add what has been mentioned here, the kind of media debate and an atmosphere of generalized fear and anxiety. It can also be a quite handy populist move to actually frame the debate in those terms, because you can play on this. You can, for political point scoring, you can actually feed it by framing questions in this manner. So it's a very wicked problem in itself, I think. But I think that's an issue that needs to be kept in mind, that it's always a question of political prioritization. What issue should we be dealing with first or prioritizing? And of course, realizing that planning always has to be about keeping, if it's serious, more than one of these in mind at the same time. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
Anyone wants to comment or respond? Or
I think one thing that I would like to add is that we are talking about safety as very much towards crime, and crime is actually some kind of everyday life event that we might build houses that might be a little bit better to, again, all these kinds of ideas that have its basic. You asked about Jane Jacobs before. This is kind of everyday life safety, I would say. But when we talk about maybe things like climate change, we are talking about really a crisis situation. And then the frame of safety and the analysis of it is entirely different. Even the preparedness of the society is completely different when we think about crime and when we think about terrorist attacks or even natural hazards like the ones that really hit in the United States, that not only devastate big, huge areas, but also affect people very differently, including making certain, like women, more vulnerable. There are papers about that, how actually women and certain groups be more vulnerable than others, because and the initial cause would be climate change, big natural events and things like that. We are talking about planning in a way that is very like what we see tomorrow, but what about planning for biggest things that we cannot really plan very well? I think it's also important to put on the table, maybe for others to comment.
I think that this was a very short presentation in the beginning, but robust decision-making methods, using them is supposed to make people feel more safe. That's the whole issue. And we are currently evaluating our trials, tests with municipalities, interviewing the before and after. And the hope is that applying these methods will make them feel more safe. And if that's true, I don't see why you couldn't apply these methods to other uncertain factors that can happen in any area, Danderyd or any Million Program area, and try to not look at the medium outcome, but try to embrace uncertainties and make plans for what can happen, and be prepared. I think that would actually make people feel more safe, knowing that there is a preparedness even if the worst happens.
Do you think it's important to sort of put forward or to stress planning as basically dealing with uncertainties?
Well,
is that productive?
Yes, that's a question that, because I come from the natural science side, and for me and others like me, we don't want to downplay the uncertainties of impacts of climate change, so that we have to deal with uncertainties. Whether or not this should be done with other threats as well, I think I sort of throw the ball to the planners in this panel.
No comment from...
Is that me?
Yeah. We were actually about to wrap up, but just a few more.
Well, I think there's I think this is also, I think this is really complex, because it's about where we place fears. This is, of course, deeply psychological, and I'm no psychologist, so I can't, but I think that to some extent, we work together also in the climate change project. I think to some extent, being prepared can also be about feeling less safe, and realizing placing the fears in the right place, and the uncertainties, becoming conscious of them and having sort of a culture of uncertainty. Because I think planning is about dealing. Planning is about dealing with uncertainties, because the future is always uncertain. But then there are different sort of modalities of doing this. One in which you imagine that you can actually tame and control the future development, and one in which you start thinking about the future development. You make plans, but there's part of the learning process is also realizing the uncertainty and all the very complex factors that can influence how these plans unfold. So I think and to me, I would make a normative stance saying even that it's actually more helpful and productive to nurture a sort of culture of uncertainty in planning, rather than nurturing the more kind of, if you want to be very broad-brushed, a modernist, kind of high modernist culture of planning, where it was imagined that you could actually predict and control the future to a larger extent. I think we've learned by now that, we need to make plans, but we also need to always keep in mind that we cannot be sure about them.
Can I just butt in? I think that's what made me so excited about your project, Annika, is this idea of robust decision-making and dealing with uncertainties, because I think you'd want urban planning to take that approach to a much higher extent. Going from kind of the absolute decisive planning of the welfare state based on loads of statistics and so on that turned on, much of what was planned is still highly valid, but yet things have been transformed in ways that couldn't be foreseen, not least the sort of disappearance of the housewife. These areas aren't populated anymore the way they used to be. There are all kind of technological changes that alters the potential of these spaces, Going from that to today's, in a certain way, non-planning you know, just allowing for the housing market to develop its products for an attractive consumer. So it seems to me like introducing some sort of robust decision-making in urban planning based on uncertainty seems to me a really fantastic way of working. To introduce that, to try to establish that and also, I'm just talking on here, but I also think it's extremely interesting to see what kind of connections can be made across these two separated ideas of environmental sustainability and social sustainability and so on, because obviously safety is something that goes across those, you know, spheres and so on, and it just seems to me so unproductive to maintain those barriers. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has a comment to that, and if you want to say, if I've got a couple of other questions, but I'm going to skip that now and just see if you've got anything more to say, and we will have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience.
I think we haven't associated the concept of, for instance, safety with traffic safety. I mean, you mentioned, which there we wouldn't think twice to think about the values and the number, but as soon as we go towards something less tangible, then we feel a bit unsettled about thinking about numbers. But I do think that there are a number of methods that in planning that I think are kind of interesting to perhaps to be used. I think here at the KHH there are people that working with instead of forecasting, they do backcasting, and this is something that also attracts me a lot, because it is for me it is kind of nice to think what is actually a little bit of what I was asking the Ross ideas, which kinds of society we want. So first you put that as an object and then goes back and say, how do we achieve that? And I think it's kind of a nice, because we know that there is a margin of, but still it allows for a number of uncertainties, and it makes much more humane to think on the components when you think about that. So your method, but also others that maybe are out there that haven't been explored in criminology in my specific area, which I think is kind of interesting to take on.
I'll just throw one more thing in. There's a horrible Swedish movie. It's not really available on Netflix or anything, but you might be able to find it. It's from 1973. It's called Stone Face, Stenansiktet, and it was by the director Janne Halldorf.
I've seen it. It's on YouTube.
I'm sorry?
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube. Okay, good. It's about a disgruntled social worker who is critical of the urban development of Skärholmen, which is one of the Million Program areas, and he's so disparaged that he actually coerces the local youth gang into murdering the city architect. And so this plays upon all of these issues that we're dealing with, you know, and that the youth gang really places the whole community in fear. Wonderful scenes when they're walking by some old lady, you know, that's one type of fear. And then there's the fear of the social worker thinking of what type of society are we building for the future? This is not worthy. We have to cut the head. We have to kill the city architect, and there's so many levels to it that are still being played out in terms of the physical environment that we are providing, and this is the difficulty not only of building but of planning for a future society.
Mm.
I think we have seen a similar process when housing areas that were initially allmännyttiga, in English is allmännyttiga,
Oh, the municipal
housing.
or public housing.
Yeah,
Yes.
start to become private. I heard that there were situations when there were threats and people trying not to kill each other, but that there was lots of threats going on in small communities and buildings. So we are not, I mean, maybe we are there, and obviously the safety aspect was there. We are not building, but we are maybe changing the housing ownership, and that really creates some kind of uncertainty and also kinds of threats between people. Honestly, it's a more modern parallel, but it leads also to think about how we are, well, the issue of housing and safety in a more concrete way nowadays, I guess.
Well, I think one challenge is in trying to make some sort of correlation between safety and space and how planning can deal with these issues is to avoid falling into the trap of architectural determination, and that there's a complete and sort of exact link between the environments we build and the lives that they produce. And obviously, even though these films still exist and the same arguments reoccur, and certainly in the stigmatization of the Millennium Programme, they're very strong still, there's the kind of vital factor of understanding how housing is just one component of the social and economic realities that they are embedded in. But I guess that notions of interconnectivity remain important. Should we have some questions from the audience? Yes.
So, as you were talking, I'm thinking there's kind of this calculus of, you know, women are quite vulnerable in public spaces. It's often not reported, and so we don't really know what the number is. But they're not at the planning table, right? Often enough, and so. You know, I remember in the mid-1990s, the sort of realization of the postmodern dream. We've arrived. The authorities, the construction authorities are gone. Now we can, have some varying voices. But the reality is that over and over we see repeated, even once the authorities are gone, and we have still the power structures reproduce certain voices and certain people at the table. And they look more legitimate because, well, we just arrived here by chance. So how do we actually empower the marginalized individuals, to be at the table, to really empower and legitimize them? Because at this point, it now seems like you're just constructing, and that seems like a big problem with a postmodern dream.
Maybe that's a question for Jonathan.
Well, I mean, we live to some extent in the era of at least imagined participatory democracy, when everyone can participate supposedly and form the local environment supposedly. I think still we live in an era of very strong, as you say, very stable power structures which form the agenda in the important decision-making forums, and where participatory forums that are labeled as such often are sideshows, disconnected sideshows in various ways. So, I mean, my answer to that question is always, well, there's invited participation. 9 out of 10 times you can count on those forums being diversions. But then there's also uninvited participation, which is usually more powerful. I mean, make a fuss. I think that's the only way still, because, as you say, very little has changed in very many of the strong decision-making forums around urban development. I speak mostly now of, for instance, of the Swedish context, and where there actually is a substantial change sometimes, like we have seen for the past, to some extent, 4 years in Stockholm, of at least issues about, gender, not equality, but gender consciousness on the side of traffic planning or on the side of urban planning. There's a strong backlash that we're seeing now. So I think the only answer still, unfortunately, is to make a fuss. I don't have a better answer, I'm sorry.
Well, there's another way is to actually engage in a political party and sit in one of those local councils. an old-fashioned way. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, everyone, for your insights. It's very interesting. I want to ask, how come no one actually mentioned the issue of gentrification in the discussion of sustainability, safety, planning? So is that not really an issue here in Sweden, or gentrification?
It's definitely an issue. Yes. And I can apologize for not talking more about that. Time is short, but of course this is a key. The growing segregation of our urban areas is driven by gentrification and the commodification of housing, and these processes are very present in Sweden right now. I don't know if you've talked about there are 3 reports from Malmö, Gothenburg, and Stockholm published in the last 4 or 5 years, each pointing at the effects of segregation in terms of an average lifespan that can differ as much as 8 years, depending on if you grow up in a socioeconomically strong or a socioeconomically weak area. And the gentrification processes are driving this segregation. And the new housing market is one of the primary contributors to also the gentrification processes of the existing stock. And this is definitely a planning issue. There are a great number of wonderful documents showing how we should plan the city, but if you look at how the city is actually being built, it doesn't follow those plans.
And there's also linked to schooling and this sort of free schooling system we have in Sweden, where kids who grow up in the same neighborhood, some are placed in better schools elsewhere, so it sort of undermines knowing the kids in your neighborhood and so on. It adds sort of greater distance and fragmentation between people who actually live in the same area. There's less sites of coming together, I think. This is something I picked up, and I don't think it's been sufficiently studied, but the schooling system definitely has an impact on sort of a sense of local communities and diversity and so on. Yes?
This is just a personal question, but aren't there a lot of people benefiting from segregation? Otherwise it wouldn't happen. I mean, the white Swedish middle class who more or less live in segregated areas, they must be very happy with that. So I mean, there are people, winners and losers. Not everybody lose. Some people get to live with people of exactly the same kind as themselves, and they are happy with it. Or am I wrong?
Well, yeah. Can I say something? Well, I think that, obviously, and we're getting to this now, these are obviously political questions, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that there's no escape. I think professionals, I think researchers, we can contribute with knowledge, with new perspectives, with empirical data, but to imagine that there is a given perfect fix that is neutral, that is not political.
That would be the managerial approach.
Yeah, that then is an illusion, most probably, dangerous such. So I think that to be a savvy researcher in the context in a culture of fear, perhaps especially dealing with issues of safety, and I'm sure you all do, but I think it's really important to have a consciousness of the deeply political nature, that you will inevitably, your research will become a pawn in a political game. So I think it's crucial to keep that consciousness, even though that can be a bit debilitating, perhaps.
And the uneven distribution of risks and the uneven distribution of safety and the outcome in terms of gated communities that Vanja started by pointing out and so on. Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, a society with the increasing divides is an increasingly dangerous society. We're going to put a stop there, I think. And thank you all so much for taking part in this conversation. And let's meet up downstairs for a drink, yeah? Yep. That's good. Okay.
Thank you, Katarina, for doing an excellent job in modern